by talking about Brian Hoare, because the reason why I'm standing here today is because of this gentleman, Brian Hoare, who you probably all know about Brian Hoare. He started his 24-hour, 7 days a week, 365 days a year protest opposite Parliament, in front of Parliament, in Parliament Square. He started in 2001. And he originally went down to Parliament Square because he was so outraged about the economic sanctions on Iraq, and he wanted to show his outrage about this, and went down there, started off just with a chair, sitting there, and his protest was snowballed. He continued sitting there for years, and he's still there today. In 2002, the government became more aware of Brian Hoare when his display kind of started to build up, and it was slowly taking up the whole of the pavement opposite Parliament. And for obvious reasons, MPs, they didn't want to be reminded about what was happening in Iraq. They wanted to have pictures of what the economic sanctions were doing against particularly infants in Iraq, whereby these sanctions were banning simple, basic things like medical supplies to Iraq, and were causing young infants, women and children, civilians, to die in Iraq. So they started to go about trying to get rid of him. And then obviously the outbreak of war in 2003, he was gaining more and more publicity. They first of all started from 2002 to get rid of him by saying that his display was obstructing the highway, and they took him to court, and he actually won his court case. He actually successfully argued that his display wasn't causing obstruction of the highway, and he was allowed to continue his display there. So the government, they then got thinking, you know, what are we going to do? How are we going to get rid of this guy, Brian Hoare? And they were bringing in the Serious Organised Crime and Police Act, and they thought, we'll stick a section in it under 132, saying that anyone who is protesting within a kilometre of Parliament has to apply for authorisation. So this is, just so you can visualise it, this is, I guess, Brian Hoare is somewhere around, is it there? No, that's, there. Okay, yeah, there I am. He's right there at the moment, and the red line around this area within the Council of Westminster is the restricted protest zone, and it's approximately a kilometre around the whole of Parliament. And so what this restricted protest zone means is that anyone wishing to hold a peaceful demonstration or any sort of vigil within this zone needs to apply for authorisation from the Metropolitan Police Commissioner. And this authorisation, when it was first brought in, it had to be within 6 days, and now it's been, because of a lot of publicity, it's now been reduced to at least 24 hours. But what this piece of legislation means is that when you're planning a demonstration, you have to fill out this application form, and you have to say how many people are wanting to attend your demonstration, how many banners you want, how much noise you're going to make, where you're going to stand, and for how long. So you can apply to have a 24-hour vigil, say, in Parliament Square with 500 people, and the Metropolitan Police Commissioner has to say yes. But then they can say, no, you can't have your 500 people, that's too much of a terrorist threat. We'll allow you to have, say, 50 people, and you can say, okay, we want it in Parliament Square, and they can go, no, that again is too much of a terrorist threat. You may get terrorists coming up and hiding within your protest, and that could be too much of a threat. We're going to put you, somewhere. Okay, we're going to put you on the opposite side of the Thames, maybe near the London Eye, which is within the protest zone. And you can say we want, 500 banners, and they'll go no. 5 banners, you're allowed 5 banners. And you can say, we'd like a loudspeaker to help maintain the protests. For safety's sake, if things maybe get out of hand and you want to use a loudspeaker to give directions to people of what to do. And again, the police can deny you that right to use a loudspeaker to help you maintain order. So So this piece of legislation restricts your free right to protest. Not only are you not allowed to just spontaneously go down to Parliament and start a protest on the day if you're outraged about something you see in the news, you're also restricted, but you also have severe restrictions on an organised demonstration. What's my next slide? Okay, right, so on the day that I was arrested, and which led to my conviction in December, I was taking part in an anti-war protest called 100,000 Rings for Iraq, and it was marking the 1-year anniversary of the Lancet report, which came out in 2004, and that had estimated 100,000 Iraqis had died as a direct result of the war. So we were having this remembrance ceremony in several locations around the southeast, and one of them was opposite Downing Street. And it was basically, you may have read about it or heard about it, it was basically ringing a bell and reading out the name of an Iraqi, and we decided to read out the names of British soldiers as well to highlight that it's not that Iraqis are not the only victims of war, it's also the British soldiers, it's also soldiers. And so this is what we were doing when I was arrested in October 2005. Both me and Mill were standing opposite Parliament, standing opposite Downing Street, reading these lists of names, and we knew beforehand that we were going to be arrested for this act, but we decided that we were going to do this out of the principle of standing up for our civil liberties, making a point. And for me personally, I did it because I believed that what I was doing wasn't wrong, it wasn't harming anyone, and I was willing to gain a criminal record for standing up for what I believed in. So that's why I personally took part in that protest, the 2-person protest that day. And we were both more or less immediately arrested and taken to the police station. I was charged for participating, and Mill wasn't charged on the day, but he was charged in January of 2006 for organising an unauthorised demonstration. And he was actually charged after I was convicted, which was December 2005. So that is my kind of background. That's why my case was the Preston case. It just so happened that my trial was put before all the other people who had been arrested under this piece of legislation. The legislation came in August 2005, and there was quite a few people campaigning against it. There were people in Parliament, you may have heard about them, the Parliament picnickers, they've been campaigning against it. Stop the War, they had a big protest on the day that it came in, which was the 1st of August, and a whole bunch of people were arrested that day. And in all, I was the 20th person arrested under the piece of legislation. But for certain reasons, I'm not sure why, my case was put before everyone else's. And I think that's because everybody else was in bunches, were in batches of 4 or 5, so it would have taken 2 or 3 days to hear their evidence, whereas I was by myself. So they just plonked me in a little kind of morning slot. So I think that's why my case was slotted in before everyone else. So since then, I've been involved in lots of different actions to continue protesting in Parliament Square and defying this piece of legislation. And I'm involved with some other activists in London called the Mass Action Group, and we've been doing actions in Parliament Square, but we've not very regularly. We've done 2 so far to highlight this piece of legislation, keep it in the media limelight, and to actively defy this piece of legislation, to show the government that we're not willing to back down. And our focus, because it's mainly made up of peace activists, our focus is Iraq, and namely we've been focusing on the Fallujah massacres, which happened in 2003 and 2004, and highlighting what happened at those massacres where the US, with the support of the UK, surrounded the city of Fallujah and bombarded it with chemical weapons. Amongst one of them was white phosphorus, which is a really horrible chemical weapon which burns the skin and burns down to the bone. So this is kind of like the area that we've been working around. The most recent thing that we've organised was the No More Deluges peace camp, and it started on the 28th of October last year, and we did a little peace walk around Northwood. We went to the US Embassy, this is outside the US Embassy, and we had a vigil outside the US Embassy. We marched down Oxford Street to Tavistock Square, and we just hit kind of like the hot spots of London on Saturday. And then on the Sunday, we all gathered in Parliament Square, and at 12 noon we had a remembrance ceremony of reading out the names of the dead, and then we all set up camp. There was about 60 people. We all popped up our little disposable tents and set up camp for 24 hours. And as you can see, the police were there all the time. They surrounded us as soon as we arrived and started to construct our tents. They moved in on several occasions, handing out warnings saying that unless we moved on, we'd be arrested, and that we were breaking this law. Throughout the whole thing, I was warned about 5 times that I'd be arrested, but I wasn't actually arrested on the day for this No More Deluges thing. One of our organisers, Gabriel, he was arrested. You probably all know Gabriel because he does a lot of work with Voices. Well, he is Voices in the Wilderness UK, and he does the newsletter. He was arrested on the day and then later released. Everybody who was arrested, there's about 10 people, they were all released without charge later on in that day. Myself and Mill from JMV, we were both handed letters at the peace camp saying, come for an interview next week. And so we went for an interview in early November, and they asked me several questions about my involvement in the peace camp. And I gave them a detailed account of all the things that I'd helped to do to organise it and help to promote it, and why I'd been involved in campaigning about what's been happening in Iraq and my feelings about it. And they told me to return a month later. Meanwhile, on the other side, my conviction from December 2005, we were appealing against it, and that was going to the High Court, and that was being heard in the High Court in November. So my feeling is that the police didn't want to press charges against me at that particular time, because what was going to happen in the High Court was going to shape this piece of legislation. Because we were appealing against our guilty convictions, and if we had won that High Court appeal, then it would have shaped this piece of legislation. It would have eroded the right which the police had to use against people. So they were kind of holding back, I think, on charging me until late December. What happened at the High Court? Our lawyer presented this argument. He felt that arguing that not that the law was wrong, but that the police had used the legislation in a particularly severe way. He felt that we had a better chance of winning with that argument, rather than just arguing all out that this piece of legislation is wrong, it's an erosion of our civil liberties, it contradicts with the European Court of Human Rights Articles 10, 11, freedom of speech and expression. He kind of felt, our lawyer kind of felt that if we argued that the police had been too severe in our cases, that we had a better chance of winning, and that would then shape the legislation. It would mean, if we won, it would mean that the police had less power in the future to arrest the peace activist who was doing a similar thing to myself. So we kind of went along with it, and at the High Court, I kind of had misgivings about going along with it, because our lawyer, he was standing there going to the judge, we're not saying that this piece of legislation is wrong, and there was about 30 of us in the back row going, yes we are, yes we are. And so he, I had a lot of misgivings about it, but I could tell from the way the judge was kind of listening to this line of argument, he wasn't really buying it, because it was obvious that we protesters were defying this piece of legislation. We believed that it was wrong, and that was it, full stop. And a month later, the judge delivered his verdict and said that they didn't find in favour of us, so we lost the High Court appeal. And I was promptly charged by the police for organising and participating in the No More Deluges, as was Mill. So we had last week we had our court hearing where they set the date for your trial, and that was quite exciting because Mill and I, we went along and we were supposed to just give our plea, which was not guilty. We were representing ourselves, and we were standing in the witness box giving our information, and the first question that they ask you is, what's your date of birth? And both of us kind of just sit there and said, we're not going to give our date of birth. And it's not a legal requirement under law, but the court likes to have your date of birth so they can keep a complete record on you. And our stand is that we don't want to give our date of birth. There's not a legal requirement to give your date of birth, and it's also reversing the relationship between the individual and the state. Instead of the state being answerable to the individual, it's becoming a situation where the individual is becoming answerable to the state. So that's why we didn't give our date of birth, and it really annoyed the magistrate. The magistrate sat there and she went, I think you need to see the duty solicitor. And we're both going, no, we're not going to do this. It's not a legal requirement. We're not going to do this. And she was going, I'm going to let you leave the room now to see a duty solicitor, and I think you should change your mind, or else I'm going to hold you in contempt of court. So we left the courtroom and we asked the duty solicitor, and the duty solicitor went, oh, I'm not really sure. I'm not sure it's a legal requirement. So he phoned up his central office, and they got someone looking through the legal books trying to find out if it was a legal requirement. We phoned up Liberty and said, have they brought in the legislation yet? Because they're trying to bring in the legislation. And Liberty, they were saying, no, it's not part of the legislation yet. It's being brought in Scotland and Wales, but not in England yet. And we came back, and I think their clerk must have been looking through the books and found that it hadn't come into force yet. And they left us all day until the end of the day, until 5 o'clock. We went into the courtroom, our case was called, went into the courtroom, and the magistrate court, which the magistrate who had sent us away, stood up, left the room, and another magistrate came in. And then said, right, yes, we know who you are. Let's just get on with it, shall we? We all know who you are, and we know what your date of birth is, so let's just get on with it. So the next round is the trial on the 10th of April for this peace camp. And because we were the only ones given these letters, because we actually phoned up the police a bit before the peace camp and said, yeah, we're involved in this, and we're part of the organising team, and we're doing this as a direct defiance of this legislation. That was the reason why they couldn't just ignore the fact that we had placed these phone calls. So on the 10th of April, we're going to be defending ourselves, and we have 7 witnesses, and they're all the other members who helped organise the legislation. We're going to be delivering our own legal argument about why the legislation is wrong. And I guess we're just going to be using it as a political platform to kind of say, we're not going to back down about this piece of legislation is wrong. So that's the next round on the 10th of April. Look out for that. Now, usually, how much time have I got left? Do you know? Are you timing it or?
I haven't actually. No, sorry.
Okay.
5 minutes. About 5 minutes.
Okay, 5. Yeah, fine. Now, usually I kind of go on. Yes. Okay. So the Serious Organised Crime Police Act, SOCPA. People kind of like the criticism that I get, that I have got from critics talking about SOCPA. They go, what are you peace activists whinging about? SOCPA, it just means that you can't protest within this little area around Parliament, it's the size of a postage stamp, and you've got nothing better to do. But the thing about SOCPA is that they've brought in this piece of legislation, and they can just start tagging things onto it. And April of last year, they tagged on this new part to SOCPA, saying that anyone wishing to protest around military bases, especially military bases which have weaponry in it, can also be arrested and charged with Serious Organised Crime Police Act. And so bases such as Menwood Hill now comes under the piece of legislation. And these 2 women last year, they were arrested in April outside Menwood Hill, and they'd gone there with their bolt cutters to break in and to deliberately defy this piece of legislation that came in that day. So, SOCPA's very worrying. It doesn't just doesn't just refer to the protests only around Parliament. It refers to military bases, and eventually, my feeling is that it's going to refer to government buildings as well. So if you know, government buildings within your town or city which you want to protest under will eventually come under SOCPA. So it's a gradual erosion of our civil liberties and right to freely protest. And then other pieces of legislation which have existed for quite some time, the Terrorism 2000 Act, that's been used for, well, yeah, it came in 2000, it's been used for 6 years now, against Muslims, Afro-Caribbeans, Asians, and a lot against peace activists. During the beginning of the war, 2003, a lot of peace activists went to Fairford to protest against the war, and within that period of a month of peace activists going to Fairford, there were 600 stop and searches against peace activists within that area of the military base. And people who I've spoken to who were at the protest, they said, you know, they were stopped and searched 4 or 5 times that day. And it's a deliberate use of power by the police to put peace activists off. Like if they see peace activists going to a protest and they know where they're going and they don't suspect them of being a terrorist, they use this piece of legislation against them to deliberately put peace activists off, and so people are less likely to kind of go out and protest. I think you may have heard about Walter Wolfgang at the Labour Party conference. He shouted nonsense at Jack Straw, who was talking about foreign policy, and he got bundled out of the conference by heavy-handed security. I think he was about 90 years old. He's at least 90 years old, maybe 93. And they took him out of the conference, and they used this piece of legislation, the Terrorism 2000 Act, to stop him from going back into the conference again. And they knew he wasn't a terrorist. They didn't bother searching him for nuclear weapons or anything like that. They knew he was a peaceful protester voicing his freedom of speech, and yet this piece of legislation was used against him in that case. And then Muslims. This is an area which Justice Not Vengeance has started to focus on, especially this year. We're highlighting Islamophobia, and especially now that these pieces of legislation are directed against Muslims, and there's a lot of hatred within, or a lot of fear within our community about Muslims, and I think that's been brought about by these pieces of legislation, which kind of conjure up the idea that Muslims are terrorists and that we need to be protected against the threat of terrorism. And terrorism, you know, it is a real threat, but we need to campaign about the roots of terrorism, why people become terrorists. By introducing these pieces of legislation, it's actually marginalising Muslims within their community to actually feel resentment towards this government, and it's actually pushing them more towards the extreme. And also, if you're going to be if you're at the point where you're going to commit an act of terrorism, it's not likely that you're going to go around dressed as a typical Muslim, like in a full hijab or a man with a beard and a turban. You're going to move away from the image of a Muslim, and you're going to go undercover a bit. And that's the same. You can argue against the Serious Organised Crime Police Act. If you're a terrorist and you're going to blow up Parliament, you're hardly going to do it at an anti-war demonstration. You're probably going to go in your own free time and hijack a bus and drive it into Parliament. So the arguments which our government is using to justify this piece of legislation is actually leading for Muslims to become more marginalised in their community and pushing them more towards terrorism. So that's something that JMV is going to be looking at this year. And then finally, I'm just going to end by reading a small section from my book. I've written, with the help of Mill at Justice Not Vengeance, I've written a short account of my experience being arrested. It was my first time I'd been arrested in this country and convicted. and what it was like and why I'd done that, and what has kind of influenced me in my life and led me to the point of being arrested. So it kind of talks a bit about things that I've been involved in and my work with anti-war groups. But I'm just going to read the last section from the chapter called Our Power. And Our Power is all about kind of encouraging people to take action in their community and saying, you know, there is hope, there is a chance that we can actually achieve things in life. Okay. Being in the peace movement has helped me to appreciate that change is born out of lots of small drops in the ocean. Expecting change overnight can be emotional suicide. At the same time, sometimes we have a dramatic effect way beyond what we're expecting. I suppose our remembrance ceremony is an example of that. Another, much more powerful example comes from the Vietnam War. What I find amazing is that the big Vietnam moratorium demonstration, which happened in Washington, D.C. on the 15th of October 1969, where 100,000 people were calling for an end to the war, had an effect completely unknown to the organisers. Secretly, President Nixon had issued a series of nuclear threats against North Vietnam, amounting to a nuclear ultimatum. Nixon was trying to force the North Vietnamese government to effectively surrender, and to force the South Vietnamese guerrillas to halt their war on US forces. And he was threatening to drop a nuclear bomb on North Vietnam if this didn't happen by the 1st of November 1969. After the Vietnam moratorium demonstration, the president's advisors told him that there could not be use of a nuclear bomb because it would obviously cause such a huge wave of protest, internal physical turmoil, mobilizing public opinion, averted the world's second nuclear war, and the demonstrators had no idea of what they had accomplished. We have power, more power than we know. By being active with our friends and neighbours, by educating the people we live and work with, and by putting pressure on those who make crucial decisions, we do change the world. Not as fast as we would like to, but we do. I hope that my story will encourage more people to become active for whatever cause is close to their hearts. I hope especially that some people will read this book who oppose the ongoing war in Iraq, will be encouraged to support and become active with their local peace groups. So we will not have to remember the deaths of ever-increasing number of Iraqi civilians and Western soldiers. Most of the time we will make painfully slow progress. Sometimes our actions will have an impact far beyond what we expect or can imagine.